English and Seymour. Please tell me about victim services in the juvenile justice system. How did it get started?
Well, this is 2003. The victims' rights field is 31 years old this year. And needless to say, we spent the first 20 years trying to fix the criminal justice system. And in doing so, we tended to neglect the fact that there were a lot of victims of juvenile offenders, which was a completely different system. And if you've never been to the Opryland Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee, you will not possibly understand this story and how the issue really emerged in terms of national impact. Sharon?
Well, the Opryland Hotel turned out to be it was an opportunity for us to try to find our room. And when we couldn't find a room, we thought, well, let's just sit down and write a report about victims of juveniles. As we were wandering through this huge hotel, luckily Ann had a laptop, and I was babbling, trying to find my room and babbling about all these other issues, and a lot of those issues had to do with victims of juveniles. So I think we finally sort of hit a point of, well, why don't we sit down? We can't find a room anyway. Why don't we just sit down, order a glass of wine, and see if we can write a report and come up with some recommendations
We
about
heard
victims of juveniles.
Patsy Cline Crazy was playing off like a mile down the green carpet.
Not the real Patsy Cline.
Yeah,
but
she was dead.
She died,
Yeah.
but they had the CD, and we heard that, and so we thought we were crazy, so we might as well go ahead and do it.
And we did. We sat down at an ACA convention and it was like a 40-pound laptop. That's in 1994. And we started saying, because we were at ACA, let's address victim services and juvenile correction. Sharon had started the premier program in the country. She knew a thing or two about it. But after Patsy Cline got to us, we had a glass of wine. We said, why stop with corrections? Let's just take on the entire juvenile justice system. And what came out of that was the ACA report and recommendations on victims of juvenile offenders, where I think we convinced ourselves, certainly, and hopefully other people, that victims of juvenile offenders had different needs, and they were unique in a lot of ways. The opening sentence came from Sharon's mouth, and she said, and I repeat her often, that victims of crime should not be discriminated against simply because of the age of their offenders. And that was sort of the premise for the report.
It was, and we started just sort of brainstorming, well, what are the differences? What are the problems? And one of the major problems is the language. With adults, it's very clear. People understand sentencing, they understand conviction, they understand prison. With the juvenile system, they really couch those in very soft terms. So you're not really convicted, they make a finding about your behavior. You don't really go to custody, you go to a placement. There's just a lot of differences like that where juveniles are protected. They're protected by confidentiality, and that's fine. And they're protected in terms of their record and looking forward. But it really doesn't help crime victims to have this foreign language when they're trying to figure out what the heck happened in their case and what are their rights. The other part of it is that the rights for juveniles are not, the rights for victims of juvenile offenders do not mirror the rights that victims have in the adult system. And so we also took that on. What are why wouldn't you, so we walked through them, why wouldn't you want notification on a juvenile offender? Why wouldn't a victim want restitution from a juvenile offender, although it's harder to get the money sometimes, although we assume they don't have resources and they do. Why wouldn't a victim of a juvenile, why wouldn't they want to make an impact statement either to the court or at the parole board hearings? So the more we went through, we went, well, heck yeah, I mean, why not? Why not? I mean, we couldn't think of one right that victims have of adult offenders that you wouldn't also want as a victim of a juvenile offender. Kind of a sidebar that we didn't address, but that came up recently when I was on the parole board doing some hearings, was that we had a 12-year-old whose father had been murdered by the person we were doing the parole board hearing for, and he wants to make a statement. And it created this big discussion about, we can't let a 12-year-old make an impact statement. And my response was, well, why not? There's nothing in the law and the Constitution that says you can't make a statement because you're too young. Now, you add some sort of logic to this. You wouldn't want a toddler there. But in this case, this is a 12-year-old, and guess what? You can be committed to the youth authority at 12. Why can't you come in as a victim? And so it also spills over to not only the victims of juveniles, but juveniles who are the victims of juveniles or the survivors of victims who were killed by a juvenile. Boy, was that a full circle statement. Whew.
So the long story short is that we published this report. It was like 22 pages. And when I say publish, you know, we like mimeographed copies and passed them out to our friends. the Office for Victims of Crime got a hold of it,
True.
and Susan Lawrence, rest her soul, who came from a juvenile justice background, said we would like to take this on as an issue. And that was about a year later in 1995, which was less than 10 years ago. And I think I can say I'm proud. I think we're both really proud that we've seen significant growth in the past 10 years in victims of juvenile offender arena. But I also think a challenge to the field is when we're talking victims, don't just think that big bad criminal justice system. As Sharon said, we must mirror the rights of victims of criminal offenders in the juvenile justice system. I think we have a long way to go.
And one other future kind of thing that needs to happen is that most of the victim witness kinds of services within the courts in the counties and states are in the adult system, the criminal system. There are very few where there is a victim witness advocate in the juvenile court system. So we need to also push for equity there. If you look at a lot of the stats about who are victims, one of the largest age groups for victimization are the teenage years, the young teenage years, the adolescent years. And yet you very seldom hear about an adolescent making an impact statement in court about the issues of restitution and that kind of stuff, because they're not considered to be in the same ballpark. So I think that would be another way for the federal government to look at this and to take it one step further, to say what are the resources we need for adolescent rape victims, dating violence victims, domestic violence victims, and these kids are beating up their siblings, and then the other kinds of crimes like robbery and homicide, and what rights should they have.
So think globally, act juvenilely.
Big picture. Youthfully.
Youthfully. Us talking about youthfully. Okay, we're done.